You think you know kings? You imagine crowns, diplomacy, glorious battles. You picture stoic figures on horseback, leading armies, or wise rulers presiding over grand courts. Well, buckle up, because the real Ludwig II of Bavaria was so much more bizarre, so much more isolated, so much more unhinged than any history textbook dares to tell you. But first, subscribe to the channel, because what we are going to tell you is incredible. A monarch who shunned his people for the company of long-dead kings. A man who built fantasy palaces while his kingdom teetered on the brink. A ruler whose descent into madness was as breathtakingly beautiful as it was utterly tragic. You're about to discover the shocking curiosities about Ludwig II that make any royal biography look like a dry historical footnote. From his nocturnal wanderings and whispered conversations with ghosts, to his obsession with a composer and his truly bizarre demise. These are the facts that will change everything you thought you knew about Bavaria's most enigmatic king. His palaces were his escape. Let's start with the most fantastical truth about Ludwig. By the end of his life, Ludwig was less a king of men and more a sovereign of stone, living in a self-made world of architectural wonders. We're talking about a man who poured his entire kingdom's fortune into fantastical castles, each one a monument to his escalating detachment from reality. This wasn't just a hobby. It was a profound psychological retreat, an elaborate, multi-million-dollar defense mechanism against the pressures of his crown and the realities of the burgeoning modern world. Imagine Neuschwanstein, the fairy tale castle that inspired Disney, sitting majestically on its craggy perch, piercing the Bavarian sky like a dream made manifest. It wasn't built for state dinners or political gatherings. No, it was Ludwig's personal tribute to medieval myths, particularly the operas of Richard Wagner and the sagas of Lohengrin and Tannhauser. It was designed as a stage set for his solitary dreams, a romanticized vision of the Middle Ages, where he could imagine himself a noble knight or a tragic hero rather than a king burdened by political alliances and mounting debts. Often, the only inhabitants were himself and a handful of terrified servants navigating its vast, echoing halls. He'd insist on secret passages and hidden staircases, not for security from assassins, but so he could roam unseen, a phantom king, in his own dreamscape, observing his own theatrical creations from concealed vantage points. The castle became his grandest costume, and he, the solitary actor, playing out fantasies of chivalry and courtly love. But here's the truly bizarre part. Neuschwanstein was just the beginning, merely the most famous symptom of his architectural fever. There was Linderhof, his intimate Rococo jewel box, nestled in a secluded valley. This palace, though smaller, was perhaps even more intensely personal. Inspired by the opulence of Versailles, it was built not for a bustling court, but for one. Its hall of mirrors, usually a space for grand balls, was where Ludwig would dine alone, often with the phantom presence of Louis XIV, whom he idolized. The palace grounds held an artificial grotto, lit by rudimentary electric lights, a staggering technological marvel for the 1870s, where he'd float on a golden shellboat, listening to operas and imagining himself as a mythical hero, perhaps Venus in her grotto. This was his sacred space, a place where the line between reality and fantasy completely dissolved. He spent countless hours here, lost in reverie, detached from the Bavarian state that paid for his increasingly elaborate escapism. And then there's Herrenchiemsee, his grandest folly, an almost identical, painstaking replica of Versailles, situated on an island in the middle of a vast lake. This gargantuan project was undertaken with the express purpose of creating a monument to absolute monarchy, an homage to the French kings he so admired, particularly Louis XIV. He wanted to be the Sun King of Bavaria, a ruler of divine right and unparalleled splendor. Yet, instead of holding court and projecting power, he'd walk its empty, cavernous halls alone at night, his footsteps echoing through the silence. He famously instructed his staff to set a single extra place at his massive dining table for the ghost of King Louis XIV of France, and would then proceed to carry on full, animated conversations, whispering secrets, discussing matters of state, or even arguing with a specter that only he could see. His own staff, sworn to secrecy and deeply unnerved, would hear his voice, a chilling sound in the dead of night, a king conversing with the long dead. This wasn't a fleeting delusion. It was a sustained, deeply ingrained aspect of his daily life within these magnificent, solitary prisons he built for himself. You don't learn this in history classes out there. But Ludwig often had these palaces built in secret, or at least with an obsessive need for privacy, far from prying eyes and the criticisms of his ministers. He'd work through the night with his architects, poring over blueprints, demanding impossible feats of engineering and craftsmanship. He'd inspect plans by moonlight, often changing his mind, scrapping entire wings, or demanding new, even more elaborate features, all while ignoring the increasingly desperate pleas of his finance ministers as the royal coffers emptied. He was literally building his own isolation, brick by magnificent brick, each castle a step further away from the crown he wore, a physical manifestation of his retreat from the world. He funded these dreams by taking out enormous loans against his personal fortune, and when that wasn't enough, against the assets of the royal house itself, pushing the kingdom to the brink of bankruptcy. He was less a monarch, more a magnificent, lonely stage director for an audience of none, performing for ghosts and the silent stone walls that surrounded him. His life became a perpetual, elaborate performance for an invisible audience, played out in the most expensive, most beautiful theaters ever conceived. His subjects might have marveled at the distant spires of Neuschwanstein, but they had no idea the lonely, bizarre existence of the king who dwelled within. Lost in his self-made, gilded cages, these castles weren't just buildings. They were the physical embodiment of his fracturing mind, the magnificent architecture of his madness. Everyone knows Ludwig II was eccentric, a mad king who built fairy tale castles. But the reality of his isolation went far beyond mere reclusiveness. We're talking about a king who preferred the company of the dead to the living, engaging in bizarre, often terrifying, nocturnal rituals that deeply unnerved the handful of loyal yet terrified servants who remained close to him. This wasn't merely a preference for solitude. It was a profound, almost spiritual engagement with unseen forces and historical figures, blurring the lines between reality and his increasingly vivid inner world. Take his dinners, for instance. It wasn't just Louis XIV. Ludwig frequently arranged elaborate meals with multiple place settings, as if entertaining a distinguished company. He would then proceed to engage in spirited debates, tender conversations, or even heated arguments with his invisible guests. Historical accounts describe servants witnessing him arguing passionately with an empty chair, gesturing grandly to a vacant space, as if a great emperor or a beloved queen were seated there. He would pour wine for them, offer them food, and meticulously adhere to court etiquette, all for an audience that existed only in his mind. These weren't just imaginary friends. Ludwig genuinely believed he was communicating directly with historical figures like Marie Antoinette, the ill-fated Queen of France, Louis XV, the pleasure-loving monarch, or even the great German poet Friedrich Schiller, whose works he admired deeply. He would discuss politics, art, philosophy, and his own personal struggles with these historical specters, seeking counsel or simply sharing his thoughts in a way he could not, or would not, with living humans. But here's the truly unsettling part. These weren't always benign conversations. Sometimes his guests were demanding, critical, or even openly accusatory. His staff, often hidden behind screens or listening from adjacent rooms, reported hearing him shout into empty rooms, his voice laced with frustration or anger, as if being contradicted or challenged by an unseen presence. At other times, they would find him cowering in fear, murmuring apologies, or whimpering as if being reprimanded or threatened by an invisible force. He would often wake up screaming from nightmares, convinced that the ghosts of his ancestors were tormenting him, for neglecting his kingly duties, for squandering the royal treasury on his castles, or for failing to produce an heir. These nocturnal visitations and internal dramas left him visibly shaken, yet he seemed unable to break free from their influence. His nocturnal wanderings were legendary and deeply unsettling to his household. He would frequently disappear from his bedroom at odd hours, sometimes in the dead of winter, roaming the vast empty halls of his castles, or even venturing out into the snow-covered grounds. Servants, alerted by the absence of his footsteps or the strange sounds, would embark on discreet searches, often finding him hours later in the most unexpected places, in a remote grotto, a hidden alcove, or standing motionless by a moonlit window, staring into space as if transfixed by an invisible presence. He would often be whispering to himself, or simply gazing intently at nothing, completely absorbed in his internal world. The silence of the castles, broken only by his solitary voice, or the creak of floorboards, created an atmosphere of chilling dread for those who served him. They lived in constant fear of what they might witness, or what the king might command. Of them in his altered state, you don't learn this in history classes out there, but his fear of actual human interaction became so severe that he'd refuse to meet with ministers during the day. All state business had to be conducted via written correspondence, even if the person was literally in the next room, or waiting directly outside his chamber door. He would communicate through intermediaries, or simply reply to written petitions, with his own sprawling, often rambling notes. He communicated more readily, and seemingly more intimately, with the dead than with his own government, the very people tasked with running his kingdom. He even developed an aversion to being seen, insisting on traveling in closed carriages at night, avoiding towns, and demanding that all blinds be drawn if he was in a room facing a public area. He was a king who could not bear the gaze of his own subjects. The man who ruled Bavaria was utterly terrified of his own people, finding solace only in the silent, imagined company of his ghostly court, retreating into a private world that grew richer and more complex as his connection to reality frayed. This wasn't just shyness. It was a profound, almost pathological aversion to human presence, replaced by an increasingly vivid and all-consuming inner world where he was the undisputed master. His life became a testament to the power of the mind to create its own reality, a reality that, in Ludwig's case, was both magnificently beautiful and tragically isolating. If Ludwig had an earthly companion, it was not a living queen or a loyal statesman, but the distant, powerful, and ultimately parasitic figure of composer Richard Wagner. Their relationship was one of history's most bizarre, and for the Kingdom of Bavaria, most destructive obsessions. It wasn't merely a royal patronage. It was a profound, almost spiritual infatuation on Ludwig's part, a complete surrender of his royal duty and resources to what he perceived as artistic genius, but what was often a calculated manipulation. By Wagner, Ludwig was mesmerized by Wagner's operas from a very young age, long before he ever met the man. He was particularly captivated by Lohengrin, A Tale of the Swan Knight, which resonated deeply with his own romantic and mystical inclinations. He saw in Wagner's soaring music and heroic narratives a reflection of his own soul, a glimpse into a world of artistic truth and beauty that transcended the mundane political realities of his life. When he ascended to the Bavarian throne at the tender age of 18 in 1864, his very first act of significance wasn't to secure diplomatic alliances, convene with his ministers on pressing state matters, or even address his people. No, his immediate, urgent command was to send a royal messenger to find Wagner, who was then living in exile and drowning in debt, notorious for his extravagant lifestyle and his radical political views. Ludwig rescued him from financial ruin, offering him a new life in Munich, free from creditors and artistic compromise. From that moment on, Ludwig lavished the composer with unimaginable sums of money, personal affection, and unwavering, almost blind support. He paid off Wagner's debts, provided him with lavish homes, funded his lavish lifestyle, and most significantly, underwrote his most ambitious and groundbreaking operatic projects, enabling Wagner to complete his monumental Ring cycle and, crucially, to build the famed Bayreuth Festspielhaus, a custom-built opera house designed specifically for his works. Ludwig was the ultimate patron saint of artistic genius, fulfilling every whim, no matter how costly, but always at a devastating cost to the Bavarian treasury and his own credibility as a monarch. Here's where it gets truly insane. Ludwig saw Wagner not just as a composer, but as a divine prophet, a kindred spirit, a divinely inspired master, a mirror to his own romantic soul. He believed that through Wagner's music, he could escape the banality of his royal duties and enter a higher realm of art and beauty. Their correspondence, voluminous and intensely personal, reads more like ardent love letters than king to subject. Communication. Ludwig would write for hours, expressing his profound devotion, his artistic yearnings, his despair at the mundane realities of kingship, and his unwavering belief in Wagner's genius. These letters often contained intimate confessions and dreams, revealing a vulnerability he showed to no one else. Wagner, in turn, fed this infatuation, praising Ludwig's exquisite and rare soul, carefully cultivating the king's adoration for his own artistic and financial gain. But the obsession wasn't mutual, at least not in the same deeply emotional and self-sacrificing way. Wagner, a master manipulator and a man of immense ego, exploited Ludwig's infatuation with ruthless efficiency. He drained the royal treasury with his endless demands for lavish furnishings, fine wines, exquisite silks, and private performances. He surrounded himself with a court of sycophants and hangers-on, all at the king's expense. While Wagner enjoyed this unprecedented patronage, Ludwig himself retreated further into isolation, increasingly alienated from the very court that was footing Wagner's bills. The composer's presence in Munich became a scandal, his arrogance, and financial demands causing outrage among the Bavarian people and the king's ministers. Wagner became a symbol of the king's fiscal irresponsibility and growing detachment, a visible manifestation of Ludwig's priorities being completely inverted. Ludwig's ministers, furious at the astronomical spending on the composer, which far outstripped the budget for necessary state affairs, repeatedly begged the king to rein in his generosity. They saw Wagner as a dangerous influence, a drain on resources that should have been used for the kingdom's welfare. They presented Ludwig with stark financial reports, warning him of impending bankruptcy. But Ludwig was impervious to their pleas, seeing their concerns as petty, uncultured complaints from those who could not understand the sublime importance of art. He believed that funding Wagner was his true destiny, a higher purpose than mere governance. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Ludwig's devotion to Wagner became an almost spiritual quest, a private religion. He would attend private performances of Wagner's operas, often as the sole audience member, sometimes even directing the staging from the royal box, completely absorbed in the drama unfolding before him. Imagine an entire opera company, a full orchestra, elaborate sets, and world-class singers, all performing only for one man, a lonely king lost in the dramatic world of gods, heroes, and tragic love, while his real kingdom slowly spiraled into financial ruin. These private, often late-night, performances were his ultimate escape, his personal communion with the genius he so revered. He would sit for hours, utterly transfixed, often weeping openly, completely subsumed by the music and the myth. His infatuation with Wagner wasn't just a passion. It was a catastrophic diversion that alienated his government, emptied his treasury, and ultimately became a key factor in his downfall. The siren song of the maestro led the king away from his throne, away from his duties, into a world of myth and artistic illusion, and inexorably closer to his own tragic end. The kingdom screamed for a king, but the king was lost in the sound of an opera played out for an audience of one. You'd think a king could rule his own destiny, that his divine right would protect him from the indignities of mortal consequence. But for Ludwig II, his reign of fantasy was destined for a terrifying, utterly confounding, and ultimately watery end. This man was so committed to his private world, so deeply ensconced in his own magnificent delusions, that his own government, exasperated and desperate, felt compelled to declare him insane, leading to one of history's most chillingly ambiguous and enduringly mysterious deaths by his final years. Ludwig was not merely eccentric. He was functionally bankrupt and almost completely estranged from reality. The mounting debts from his castle projects were astronomical, threatening to destabilize the entire Bavarian state. His ministers, desperate to save the kingdom from financial collapse and the king from himself, initiated the terrifying and unprecedented process of declaring him medically unfit to rule. This wasn't a simple political coup. It was a complex, emotionally charged, and deeply controversial medical and psychological intervention against a reigning monarch, driven by a mixture of genuine concern, political opportunism, and sheer desperation. They assembled a team of psychiatrists led by Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, a renowned neurologist. Crucially, von Gudden and his colleagues, despite the gravity of their task, never actually examined Ludwig in person. Instead, they declared him insane solely based on witness accounts from his increasingly exasperated, frightened, and often bewildered staff. Here's the disturbing, almost darkly comical part of their diagnosis. The reports meticulously detailed his extreme reclusiveness, his nocturnal habits, his bizarre conversations with historical figures at the dinner table, his utter refusal to govern or meet with anyone outside his immediate, tiny circle of servants, and his catastrophic overspending on the castles. They painted a picture of a king lost in a world of self-made delusion, a monarch utterly incapable of fulfilling his constitutional duties. The medical report, compiled from second-hand observations, portrayed him as a danger to himself and the state, a madman on the throne. On the ominous date of June 12, 1886, a royal commission, accompanied by Dr. von Gudden, arrived at Neuschwanstein, the king's most magnificent escape, with the grim task of deposing him. Ludwig, true to form, and initially in a moment of lucidity mixed with rage, resisted fiercely, even attempting to have them arrested and threatening them with violence. He was, for a brief time, confined within his own dream castle. But ultimately, after a night of tense standoff and futile appeals, he was escorted away, a prisoner in his own fairy tale, driven under guard to Berg Castle, a more modest royal residence on the shores of Lake Starnberg. But wait, it gets so much worse, descending into a true historical enigma. Ludwig was taken to Berg Castle, essentially under house arrest, guarded by attendants and physicians. He was restless and distraught, constantly watched. On the evening of June 13, 1886, a mere day after his deposition, he went for a walk along the shores of Lake Starnberg with his lead psychiatrist, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden. It was a stormy, twilight evening. They walked for some time, disappearing from the view of their attendants. A few hours later, when they failed to return, a search party was dispatched. At around 11:30 p.m., both men were found dead in the shallow, Waters near the shore. The official verdict, immediately declared by the government, was suicide by drowning, with Dr. von Gudden tragically attempting to save him and drowning in the process. This explanation, however, was immediately met with skepticism and remains fiercely debated to this day, riddled with inconsistencies that defy simple answers. Ludwig was an excellent swimmer, known for his physical prowess in the water. How could he have drowned in only waist-deep water? There were no signs of a desperate struggle on his body, no marks of violence that would suggest a scuffle. And most chillingly, an autopsy performed on Ludwig's body reportedly revealed no water in his lungs, a medical detail that critically undermines the theory of death by drowning. How then did he die? The unanswered questions fueled endless speculation. Some immediately suspected murder, perhaps by agents of the government eager to secure his deposition and prevent any potential countercoups or future claims to the throne. Was von Gudden silenced because he knew too much, or was he an accomplice? Others whispered of an escape attempt gone horribly wrong. Perhaps Ludwig tried to flee across the lake, and von Gudden pursued him, leading to a fatal accident. Or perhaps, most tragically, it was a desperate struggle between the king and his psychiatrist, a final violent confrontation between reality and delusion, ending in a mutual, mysterious demise. The circumstances were so murky, so convenient. For the new regency, that conspiracy theories blossomed immediately and have never truly withered. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but to this day, the true circumstances of Ludwig's death remain one of royal history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The official documents were incomplete, contradictory, or perhaps even intentionally misleading. The king who spoke to ghosts, who built magnificent dreamscapes, whose life was a dramatic opera of his own making, met his end in the dark, murky waters of a Bavarian lake, his private world collapsing around him in a final, inexplicable plunge. His legacy isn't just his breathtaking castles, standing as testaments to an unparalleled artistic vision. It's a masterclass in how an intense inner life, combined with absolute power and profound mental struggle, can lead a monarch down a path of magnificent, yet utterly tragic, self-destruction. The most powerful man in Bavaria became a prisoner of his own mind, his own dreams, and his own bizarre obsessions. Even death couldn't end the whispers surrounding his bizarre, beautiful, and ultimately haunting life. A mystery of his final moments, much like his life, remains cloaked in the mist of speculation and unresolved questions. If these disturbing royal facts made you question everything you thought you knew about history, maybe hit that subscribe button, because there are plenty more horrifying truths that textbooks conveniently leave out. And trust me, you haven't heard anything yet